Okay, recording na tayo. Tara, practice muna tayo ng konting sample questions dito sa audit sampling. Ayan. So this time, hindi na natin nilagay na kita agad yung sagot, no? Para at least makapag-practice ka on your own. Okay, ilan ba to? 15 items. Tara, start natin, no? First question, the entire set of data about which the auditor wishes to draw conclusions is called, anong tawag dyan? Population, ano? Letter A. Ayan. Mhm. Basta sinabing entire set of data na pinagkukuhanan ng sample, ano, population yan. Next, which of the following constitutes audit sampling? So, alin daw dito ang audit sampling? Okay, basahin natin. Letter A, selecting and examining specific items to determine whether or not a particular procedure is being performed. Okay. Sampling ba yan? Teka. Tingnan muna natin yung option B. Examining items to obtain information about matters such as the client's business, the nature of transactions, accounting, and internal control systems. Audit sampling ba yan? Okay, parang ano, no? Parang nahihirapan tayong mag-identify alin ba dito yung audit sampling. So, ganito ang gagawin mo kapag medyo mahaba yung choices na yan. Basahin mo muna silang lahat. Okay? So, yun yung gagawin natin. Letter C. Examining items whose values exceed a certain amount so as to verify a large proportion of the total amount of the account, balance, or class of transactions. Sampling ba yan? Okay, hindi mo rin sure, no? Ito, letter D. Applying audit procedures to less than 100% of items within an account balance or class of transactions such that all sampling units have a chance of selection. Okay, itong letter D parang familiar na sa'yo, no? Yung definition na yan. Nakita natin yan dun sa handout natin sa audit sampling. Okay? Less than 100% of items. Okay. Ito na ba yung tamang sagot? Yes. Okay, ito yung audit sampling. Applying audit procedures to less than 100% of items within an account balance or class of transactions. Letter D. Okay, yung ibang choices dyan, pampagulo lang. Letter A, selecting and examining specific items to determine whether or not a procedure is being performed. Okay, hindi naman yan sampling. Dinedetermine mo kung may procedure na ginawa doon sa specific items. Okay. Letter B, examining items to obtain information about matters such as the client's business, the nature of transactions, accounting, and internal control systems. So, hindi rin yan sampling, no? Okay. Ano ba to? Evidence gathering na to eh. About the background of the entity. Okay. Including its internal control. So, ano to? Parang risk assessment procedure. Okay, then letter C, examining items whose values exceed a certain amount so as to verify a large proportion of the total amount of an account balance or class of transactions. So parang merong ano to, threshold, tapos tinetest mo yung amounts above that threshold. Okay, substantive procedure naman to. Okay, so ang tamang sagot, letter D, less than 100%. Yan naman yung keyword natin dyan sa audit sampling. Number 3, the following situations will likely lead the auditor to use 100% testing except. Okay, so ang hinahanap natin dito, yung hindi belong doon sa group. Okay. So lahat daw yan, magre-result or magiging, pwedeng maging reason para mag 100% testing si auditor. Except sa isa. Okay, so tingnan natin yung choices. Letter A, when the population constitutes a small number of large value items. Konti lang yung mga items sa population pero malalaki yung value ng items na yun. Isa ba to sa reasons kung bakit pwedeng maging 100% yung itest ni auditor? Yes. Okay, so ito, tama yan. Okay, kasi hindi ka na Magsasampling ka pa ba, konti na nga lang yung nasa population tapos lahat nung nandoon ay large value items. Letter B, when both inherent and control risks are high and other means do not provide sufficient appropriate audit evidence. So, ibig sabihin, mataas yung inherent and control risk. Therefore, yung detection risk mo, dapat mong babaan. Okay, yung inherent ay mataas, yung control risk mataas din, and yung detection risk mo, dapat babaan mo. Okay, para umabot ka dun sa acceptable mo na, na audit risk. Okay? So, ang gagawin mo dyan, 100% testing. Okay? Kasi yung detection risk mo, madidecrease yun kapag tinetest mo yung mas malaking number of items. So, dito, 100% sure yan na magdidecrease yung iyong detection risk. Okay. And sinabi pa dyan, no, other means do not provide sufficient appropriate audit evidence. So, wala kang ibang pwedeng gawin kundi i-test 100% ng population. Okay, letter C, when the repetitive nature of a calculation or other process performed by a computer information system makes 100% examination cost effective. Ayan, ito rin, isa rin to sa reason kapag high-tech naman yung client, no? Tapos pwede mo nga gawin yung 100% nang hindi masyadong gumagastos. Okay, hindi lang ng oras, no, ng effort, okay, ng resources. So pwede mong gawin yung 100% examination. Ang hindi dyan is yung letter D. Bilugan na natin. When testing controls that leave audit trail. Okay, so ang involved dito, TOC, no? Test of controls, tapos yung controls na yon nakikita sa audit trail. Ibig sabihin, may mga halimbawa, pirma. Okay. Halimbawa, yung control na existing is yung mga pirma ng mga supervisor. Ganyan. Ibig sabihin, may audit trail, makikita mo siya kapag nag-test ka. Ayan. So, pwedeng mag-sampling dito. Okay, kaya hindi na magwa 100% testing. Okay? Ayan. So, dapat may audit trail, no? Okay, so yun yung number 3. Ayan. Next natin. An error that arises from an isolated event. Ito, identification lang. Arises from an isolated event that has not recurred other than on specifically identifiable occasions and is therefore not representative of errors in the population is called, anong tawag dyan? Anomalous error. Ano? Okay. Ayan. Anomalous error. Okay. Ano ba yung sampling error? Yung mag-a-arise dahil sa hindi tamang sampling technique na ginawa. Okay? Non-sampling error, basta hindi sampling error. Yung projected error naman, yung sampling error na pinroject sa buong population. No? So, ang tamang sagot dito is anomalous error. Isolated event. Okay, bakit ba napipindot yun? Yan, sige. Number 5, which of the following is true about sampling and non-sampling risks? So, letter A, sampling risk can be reduced by increasing sample size. True ba yan? True yan, no? Pero wag mo nang bilugan, baka kasi may all of the above. So, letter B, sampling risk cannot be eliminated. Pwede ba yan ma-eliminate yung sampling risk? Pwede. Okay, paano? I-test mo yung buong population. Okay, kasi ano ba ulit yung sampling risk? Yung sampling risk, yung risk na baka hindi representative yung sample nung kabuuan ng population. So, yung naalala mo ba yung dinodrawing natin dyan? Na ito yung sample. Ayan, sinade natin. Kung gusto mong bawasan yung sampling risk, lakihan mo yung sample size mo. And kung gusto mong eliminate ng todo yung sampling risk, gawin mo buong population na. O, di ba? Wala ka ng sampling risk. So, tama ba yung B? Mali yan, ano? Kasi sampling risk can be eliminated. And, okay. Letter C, non-sampling risk can be eliminated by proper engagement planning, supervision, and review. Tama ba to? Mukhang tama, no? Pero tingnan mo yung ginamit niyang term, eliminated. Puwede bang ma-eliminate ang non-sampling risk? Saan ba nag-a-arise yung non-sampling risk? 'Di ba nagbigay tayo ng example dito, human error. Okay, non-sampling risk 'yun. Puwede bang i-eliminate ang human error by just proper planning, supervision, and review? Hindi, 'no? Kasi kahit anong plano gawin, kahit anong supervise ang gawin, kahit anong review ang gawin, may mga tao talagang nagkakamali. Okey, may konting hugot pa tayo do'n, ano? So itong eliminated dito, ayan yung nagpamali dun sa sentence, ano? Reduced man pa, okey. Non-sampling risk can be reduced by proper planning and blah, blah, blah. Then letter D, non-sampling risk arises from the possibility that the auditor's conclusion based on a sample may be different from the conclusion reached if the entire population were subjected to the same audit procedure. Mali ito, no? Kasi ano ba yung dinedefine nitong definition natin? Sampling risk yan, ano? Possibility that the auditor's conclusion based on a sample may be different from the conclusion reached if the entire population were subjected to the same audit procedure. So, ang tamang sagot ay letter A. Sampling risk can be reduced by increasing sample size. Okay. Baka may tanong ka, unmute ka lang bago tayo mag-proceed sa 6 to 10. Okay. Sige, mukhang wala namang question. Tara, number 6. Which statement, yan. Which statement is incorrect? Okay, hanapin natin yung mali about sampling risk. Okay, letter A, sampling risk arises from the possibility that the auditor's conclusion based on a sample may be different from the conclusion reached if the entire population were subjected to the same audit procedure. Yan din yung binasa natin dito sa taas. And correct yan, sampling risk. Yan yung definition niyan. Letter B, risk of assessing control risk too low. Okay, control risk too low and risk of incorrect acceptance affects audit effectiveness. Okay, oops. Ano sabi? Effectiveness daw. Tama ba yan? Ano nga ulit yung nangyayari kapag yung pag in-assess yung control risk na masyadong mababa? Mhm. Okay. Kapagka in-assess yung control risk na masyadong mababa, okay. Pero in reality, mataas naman talaga siya. Okay. Maapektuhan yung effectiveness. Tama ba 'yon? Yes, tama. Okay, so tuloy natin yung pagbasa. Ito pa pala 'no, risk of incorrect acceptance. Okay, tinanggap natin, okay, pero dapat pala hindi natin inaccept. Okay. Effectiveness. Mhm. As it would usually lead to additional work to establish that initial conclusions were incorrect. Okay, so ito yung nagpamali, ano? Lead to additional work to establish that the initial conclusions were incorrect. Ayan. Parang sa efficiency siya. Mas akma, no? Okay, so itong letter B, tingnan natin, no? Baka may mas mali pa dyan. Letter C, the mathematical complements of sampling risk are termed confidence levels. Yes. Okay. Mathematical complements of sampling risk, confidence level ang tawag dyan. Then letter D, risk of assessing control risk too high is the risk that the auditor will conclude, in the case of a test of control, that control risk is higher than it actually is. Okay, yun nga yun mismo. Control risk too high, risk that the auditor will conclude in the case of a TOC that the control risk is higher than it actually is. So, true rin to. So, ang mali nga rito is letter B. Okay, risk of assessing control risk too low when in reality, mataas naman talaga yung control risk and risk of incorrect acceptance affects audit effectiveness as it would usually lead to additional work to establish that initial conclusions were incorrect. Okay, so letter B. Okay. Ayan. Sige, medyo nalito rin ako dito sa letter B. Sige, babalikan natin to. Ha? Kung ano talaga yung nagpamali dyan. Pero for now, ito yung tingin ko no, nagpamali dyan. Ayan, yung part na to. Okay, number 7 tayo. Each time an auditor draws a conclusion based on evidence from a sample, an additional risk, sampling risk, is introduced. Okay, an example of sampling risk is, so ang hinahanap lang dito, example ng sampling risk. Okay, basahin natin to. Letter A, projecting the results of sampling beyond the population tested. Hindi to, ano, no? Hindi to sampling risk. Projection, ano to, no? Error. Okay. Letter B, properly applying an improper audit procedure to sample data. So, dito, audit procedure, yung mali, ano? Yung improper. So, ito, non-sampling risk. Non-sampling risk yung B. Letter C, improperly applying a proper audit procedure. So, tama naman yung audit procedure, pero mali yung pag-apply. Non-sampling risk pa rin yan. Okay. So, ang tamang sagot dito, letter D, drawing an erroneous conclusion from sample data. Okay, so yan ang sampling risk. Okay. Basta ang tandaan mo dito, yung definition ng sampling risk. Okay, which is, nasan yun? Ito nga, sa number 6. Then lahat ng hindi papasok sa definition na yan, non-sampling risk. Okay. Number 8. Which of the following best illustrates the concept of sampling risk? Okay, puro sampling risk pala yung ano dito, na-include ko sa questions. Letter A. A random, ano yung tinanong dito? Best illustrates the concept of sampling risk. Letter A. A random chosen sample may not be representative of the population as a whole on the characteristic of interest. Okay, true yan, ano? Okay, pero yan na ba yung best? Tingnan natin. An auditor, letter B, no? An auditor may select audit procedures that are not appropriate to achieve the specific objective. Okay, true to. Pero hindi naman siya about sampling risk. Okay? Kasi, about pa rin to sa audit procedures na not appropriate. So, hindi siya pasok sa definition ng sampling risk. Letter C, an auditor may fail to recognize errors in the documents examined for the chosen sample. Auditor. So, yung nagkamali dito is yung auditor, human error, non-sampling risk ulit. Okay? And letter D, the documents related to the chosen sample may not be available for inspection. So, dito naman, documents yung nawawala. Okay, not be available for inspection. So, non-sampling risk pa rin ito. Okay, ang hinahanap kasi natin, concept of sampling risk. Kung ang tamang sagot dito is letter A. A randomly chosen sample may not be a representative of the population as a whole. Okay. Yan papalaisan yung ano, no, i-take note. Minsan, true naman lahat ng choices. Kaya lang, kapag ganun, babalikan mo yung tanong, ano ba yung hinahanap? Okay, hindi naman kasi tinanong dito, which of the following statements is false o is incorrect. Okay, so ang hinahanap dito, alin yung pertain sa sampling risk. Okay, lahat yan true, pero hindi naman about sa sampling risk yung iba. Okay, kaya pag binasa mo, ala, parang tama naman sila lahat, no? Pero hindi pala yun yung hinahanap. So, ang tamang sagot dito, letter A. Okay. Ayan. Ano pa ba? Yan, number 9. Ito, identification lang din. When the auditor goes through a population and selects items for the sample without regard to their size, source, or other distinguishing characteristics is called haphazard selection. Okay. The number 10, which of the following statistical selection techniques is least desirable for use by an auditor? Block selection. Okay, letter C. Ayan. Okay. Sige, baka may question kayo. Unmute ka lang bago tayo mag-proceed sa 11 to 15. Okay, mukhang wala naman. Tara, proceed tayo dito. Number 11, TOC provide reasonable assurance that controls are applied as prescribed. Okay, a sampling method that is useful when testing controls is, so alin dito yung para sa TOC? Letter B. Okay, attribute sampling. Okay. Pag substantive procedure, yung variable sampling. Okay. Number 12, the deviation rate the auditor will permit in the population and still be willing to reduce the assessed level of control risk is called okay, the auditor will permit daw. Okay. Ang sagot is tolerable deviation rate. Okay, the deviation rate, auditor will permit tolerable deviation rate. Okay, number 13, the tolerable rate of deviation for TOC necessary to justify a control risk assessment depends primarily on which of the following. So yung TOC, yung tolerable rate of deviation for TOC, okay, depends primarily on which of the following. So saan nakadepende yung tolerable rate of deviation para sa TOC? So tingnan natin. The cause of errors, yan ba? Hindi, no? Cause of errors. Parang hindi naman natin yan kino-consider para ma-identify natin kung ano ba yung tolerable rate natin. Letter B, the extent of reliance to be placed on the procedures. So ano ba yung ginagawa natin sa TOC? Tinitingnan natin kung magre-rely ba tayo dun sa controls. Ano? So kung gaano ba tayo magre-rely dun sa TOC, tingin mo may epekto yan sa tolerable rate natin na i-accept for deviation? Yes, no? So most likely ito yung sagot. Letter B. Pero tingnan natin baka may mas maganda pang sagot dyan. The amount of any substantive errors. Hindi rin, ano? Kasi paano malalaman yung substantive errors? Nag-TTOC ka pa nga lang. The limit used in audits of similar clients. So ito, comparable ba? Yung isang client dun sa isa pang client. Ginagamit ba natin yan? Hindi, no? Kasi unique yung mga clients, yung bawat isang client. Okay, so ang tamang sagot dito is letter B. The extent of reliance to be placed on the procedure. Yan, may mga ganito namang questions, no, na madali naman ma-identify ano yung mga mali and ano yung tama. Okay, number 14, if the auditor is concerned that the population may contain exceptions. Okay, so concerned siya that population may contain exceptions. Okay, the determination of sample size sufficient to include at least one exception is a characteristic of ito, ano lang din, ano? Identification. Sana familiar ka dun sa definition natin. Tamang sagot dito is discovery sampling. Okay, so basta may makita siyang isang exception, ayun. Ayan. Last number, at times, a sample may indicate that the auditor's assessed level of control risk for a given control is reasonable when in fact the true compliance rate does not justify the assessed level. Okay, this situation illustrates the risk of assessing control risk. Okay, control risk yan kasi ito. Sige, basahin natin ulit ha. At times, a sample may indicate that the auditor's assessed level of control risk for a given control is reasonable. Okay. So, sabi ni auditor, reasonable yung control risk. Ibig sabihin, katanggap-tanggap, mababa, no? When in fact, the true compliance rate does not justify the assessed level. When in reality, mataas pala dapat yung control risk. Anong tawag dyan? Assessing control risk too low. Obvious naman din. Ano lang to, bali reading comprehension question. Okay, the answer is letter A. Assessing control risk too low. Ayan. Okay, baka may question ka dito sa 11 to 15. Unmute ka lang. Okay. Mukhang wala naman, no? Ayan. So, take note mo yung answer key natin dito. Siguro isulat mo sa papel. Sige, i-upload ko na lang din yung annotated na copy nito. Kasi walang sagot yung nandun sa canvas nyo. Okay. Sige. Stop muna natin yung recording. Then, upload ko nga itong annotated.